back for the afternoon portion of our soil session. And of course, moving away from such exciting topics as soil management, we're going to do some nutrient management stuff too. And in order to bring us into this discussion, we brought back out of retirement Don Flaten. And so, as everybody likely knows, Don retired a year ago. He is joining us today as a retired professor of soil fertility from the University of Manitoba to speak a little bit on this issue of dealing with, like, carrying on this idea of uncertainties, where to spend fertilizer dollars in tumultuous times. And so this is kind of the beginning of a 2/3-part section for this session today, where Don is going to provide this presentation that he and Cynthia Grant put together. And then following Don, we're actually going to have a chance to hear some agronomists who will actually put this information into practice, as opposed to more of that theoretical topic. So, Don, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Marla, for the introduction. And I want to just share my screen, and I'll turn off the video here in a sec. I need to acknowledge the contribution of my co-author, Dr. Cynthia Grant. Cindy is online, I'm hoping, joining us from afar, but she's done a lot of course, excellent work on the issue of nutrient management. She's a member of the Canadian Agricultural Hall of Fame, and another co-retiree that contributed substantially to this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about where to spend fertilizer dollars in tumultuous times, focusing on some of the challenges associated with very little moisture reserve and some crop prices that are very high and fertilizer prices very high, some of the challenges that agronomists and farmers are facing. So just an overview of the drought sort of situation in Western Canada. Over 90%, I heard on the news this morning, 99% of Western Canada is regarded as being in a drought situation. Scarce moisture reserves combined with very high crop prices for basically all of the commodities. That's a big reward for proper fertilization, but it's also a penalty for under-fertilizing. And of course, fertilizer prices that have gone through the roof for both phosphate and nitrogen and the other fertilizers. Very, very challenging situation. And what we're calling it is sort of the high stakes poker table of crop production. We need to be extra careful with our fertilizer investment because of either price or availability. And I'm going to talk a little bit about two general sort of toolkits that we can use. One is crop selection and general agronomy, and the other is nutrient management. With respect to crop selection, we do have quite a bit of residual nitrate nitrogen in most of our fields in Manitoba, according to this this table here published by AgVise fairly early in the fall. Relatively large amounts of leftover nitrogen because the crop didn't use very much, and also there weren't very many losses. So you can see the average is quite high throughout Manitoba, but there still is quite a bit of variability. There's some fields that are in this normal range of, let's say, 20 to 40 pounds of N per acre, but there's some with more than 60 pounds of N per acre, lots of variability. And so some of the ideas that we've thought about would be ways that you could maximize your benefits, minimize the risk by matching crops strategically to the fields based on things like leftover nitrate nitrogen. And so where the nitrogen is low, that might be an area where you target legumes or low input crops like soybeans or lentils, peas, flax, or oats. And there's a lot of people thinking that way. Here's an example of a crop selection sort of table that emphasizes that crops like flax and lentils very high on the expected net returns. But that's not necessarily the case for all of the fields. Where a field has high reserves of leftover nitrogen, maybe that's a strategic opportunity to select a medium to high input crop like canola, wheat, or corn. Put that in that land that's got lots of nitrogen left over so that you can maybe zig when other people are zagging on their crop choices. But of course, we want to respect crop rotation. There was a good discussion about that this morning, that you don't want to be putting necessarily flax after canola, a low mycorrhizal crop. And soybeans on high nitrogen soils increases your risk of iron deficiency chlorosis. So we don't want to disrespect overall crop rotations with this strategy. And another thing to consider is market pressure. I never thought that I would see a headline in the Western Producer saying steam comes out of hot flax market where the price has dropped to only $41 per bushel. But we have to remember that crop prices for the 2022 crop could be very volatile, especially in these relatively small acreage crops. Another factor associated with crop selection and overall management is to make sure that we select crop species and varieties or hybrids that are fast growing and make good use of those soil reserves. And we also want to manage those crops to give them the best access possible to those nutrients in the soil and minimize the competition with weeds. And to that extent, general agronomic practices that benefit nutrient uptake from those soil reserves will also benefit overall crop production. On the issue of fertilizer placement, banding, and timing, we're going to get into that later, but that certainly is another factor that's affecting that early season vigor of that crop. But the second toolkit that we're going to talk about is fine-tuning our nutrient stewardship practices. And this is something that you've seen lots and lots of times before. The source, rate, time, and place are all interconnected, and they're all very, very important for overall stewardship to meet the environmental, social, and economic goals of our farming systems. But I would say that for this coming year, we should have maybe a special formulation of 4R, and I'm calling it EC. That's not emulsifiable concentrate. That's extra careful for our stewardship because of the high stakes of high crop prices and high fertilizer prices. So to talk a little bit about fertilizer rates, Manitoba is fortunate to have an N rate calculator, basically a spreadsheet calculator that enables farmers or agronomists to enter their expected nitrogen fertilizer prices and their crop prices and their soil test reserves, and then look at some scenarios and evaluate based on those prices what might be the optimum rate of fertilizer to apply. And in this example with canola, the blue squares represent the optimum rate of fertilizer application, which in this case is 120 to 130 pounds of N to that canola. But the orangey red squares represent nearby scenarios, which might be within $1 an acre of net return to fertilizer, so that farmers and agronomists can evaluate the risk. Putting on another 20 or 30 pounds of N might give them only a couple dollars worth of net return. Is it really worth that in a risky environment? And this calculator is based on field research that was conducted by Western Co-op Fertilizers, or Westco. Once again, that was referenced earlier this morning during Trish's talk. And there's a lot of site years of data. In the case of wheat, 147 site years of data. And the response curves were statistically analyzed and put into what we call a quadratic response curve. And then you could evaluate the economics of returns for different crop and fertilizer prices. Now, why do I draw attention to this so-called quadratic equation? Well, I've harped on this before, but by the time when you select an equation to describe your nitrogen response, it has a huge influence on the economic optimum rate that's calculated. And if we view the response data as two straight lines, in this case, you'd recommend 95 pounds of N for this corn response in Iowa. And if you have a curve that flattens off, you'd recommend 150 pounds of N. But if you go with a quadratic, you'd be finding that optimum at 200 pounds of N. And this is all the same data, just selecting a different response curve. So we need to remember in the backs of our minds that different response curves will give you different optimum economic rates. And so they should be taken fairly lightly in terms of the exact numbers, and used as really just sort of like case studies or general examples. But anyways, if we take that approach and we use the Manitoba N Rate Calculator with its response curves, and we look at different scenarios, medium fertilizer prices, medium crop prices, like maybe what we had last year, and we have 30 pounds of leftover nitrogen in the soil, which used to be a fairly typical number, you'd have a recommended rate of N application 115 pounds of N per acre. And that's for spring wheat. If you had a high fertilizer price and a high crop price, you'd end up with an optimum rate of 100 pounds of N. In this case, the fertilizer price went up twofold and the crop price went only like 33%, and that causes a slight drop in the optimum fertilizer rate. But if you have a high fertilizer price and you're not able to capture a high price for your crop, that's going to drop your fertilizer optimum rate down even further. But the big influence on these response curves is the amount of moisture supply for that wheat crop. If you end up with another dry year and arid conditions, and you have a high fertilizer price and a medium crop price, your optimum rate of N drops all the way down to 25 pounds of N. So there's a lot of scenarios you can evaluate with this Manitoba N calculator that's available off the web. You can download it. You can look at the canola scenarios. I went through some scenarios like that too with urea and canola prices. They don't seem to vary quite as much because canola is so responsive to nitrogen that the calculator is pushing you towards these high rates of N. But once again, remember, this is based on a quadratic response curve, and that tends to recommend relatively high rates of fertilizer. If we take a look at phosphate fertilizer rates, we don't see these nice, neat response curves. Instead, there's a lot of variability, even at the same site. And these data are all derived from the same site over a 30-year period. Big differences in the amount of P response, depending on the year and whether that crop is going on fallow or stubble. So soil test P relationships with P response just aren't as neat as nitrogen responses. And that means that we look at it more in terms of probabilities. In Manitoba's data sets, which go back into the 1950s and 60s, for example, we see that the probability of a fertilizer response to phosphate drops below 50% at anything above 18 parts per million Olsen extractable phosphorus. So if you have a soil test coming back this fall from soil that's from a field that's testing like 20 or 30 parts per million, you've got way less than 50% chance that you're going to get a response with cereals and hay crops, and even less so with some less responsive crops like soybeans, for example. Here's some data that's much newer than that. It's from, once again, the Westco data set, but it shows similar numbers in that 10 to 20 ppm range for Olsen soil test P. Wheat is responding about 50% of the time. As soon as you go above 10 ppm, the response drops off to much less than 50%. And then looking at an individual site over multiple years, these response curves from a Saskatchewan study show that not only could you expect a less frequent response in a higher testing soil, you also get a smaller yield response. So in this particular case, the soil that did not receive any broadcast phosphate at the beginning of the experiment, that had low phosphate fertility throughout the whole experiment responded handsomely to that seed row placed P. But the soil that had the high rate of broadcast applied on at the beginning of the experiment had only small response. So overall, if you're prioritizing fields for P fertilizer, it would be certain crops like wheat and canola, and you'd also prioritize the soils with the lowest soil test P levels. Now, overall, as mentioned this morning, I think it was Stuart Boyd that mentioned we need to be careful about long-term versus short-term strategies for phosphate fertilization. If we take a look at the short-term sufficiency approach, that's where we just put enough phosphate, usually with the seed, to maximize the return on investment in that 1 year. But the rate of application in that strategy is usually less than crop removal. So over the years, your soil test P and your P fertility will decline. And this is suitable for short-term land tenure and when P costs are high relative to crop prices. In a year like this is probably the right time to consider going with a fairly modest rate of phosphate fertilizer. And that's typically what the Soil Fertility Guide recommends. If you had 10 ppm of Olsen P and you're growing a cereal crop like wheat, it would be recommending only 30 pounds of P2O5 per acre. And that's probably going to be less than what a 60 bushel wheat crop is going to be removing. So it doesn't maintain your fertility for the long term, but it might be a good strategy for this particular year. Overall, though, we recommend farmers consider their long-term sustainability approach. And if you aim to reach or maintain, let's say, a soil test P target range between 10 and 20 part per million, you'd be building up maybe on your low P soils that have less than 10 ppm. And if you've got more than 20 ppm, you can just put on starter P and let that phosphate fertility bank help support your crops for a while and not necessarily worry about it getting down too low, because you're picking a target, let's say 10 to 20 ppm. The long-term economics considers the residual P value, but you really need that long-term land tenure to make it pay off for you. And it's only suitable when P costs are decent relative to crop prices. I would say right now it might be a little bit of an overly expensive strategy. Also remember, as I mentioned before, that P response varies with crop species. So we see way more response with wheat and canola than we do for flax and soybean. So if fertilizer cost is high and the P is medium to high in that 20 to 20 ppm range, maybe just ban modest rates of starter P in the seed row to your cereals and canola, and then skip the phosphate fertilizer for the soybean and flax for a year like this. Anyways, just a few brief comments about sulfur and potassium and micronutrients. I'm not going to talk very much about those nutrients. They're just as important as N and P, but the responses to fertilizer are much less frequent. So I think it's very, very important to apply those only if your soil test recommendations indicate that it's needed. And I would be recommending following the provincial soil fertility guide recommendations on this. Except for sulfur, I think that sulfur is such a relatively inexpensive nutrient to apply, and it's such a valuable insurance, especially on canola crops, to have that sulfur applied. I think that that's probably something that most canola growers would routinely apply. And if you're going to need sulfur, it just has to be in the sulfate form. The most reliable way to ensure that it's in that form for the crop is to apply it as sulfate. For potassium, the critical soil test threshold is anywhere between 100 and 200 ppm. In other words, if you have more than 200 ppm, regardless of the crop that you're growing, our recommendations would be that you don't get a profitable response to K fertilizer. And then for the micronutrients, there's some recommendations you could look at there. And if producers want to invest in nutrients that aren't indicated as deficient on their soil test, that's up to them. But this would be our recommendation based on our data. So how do you know whether the rates of your nutrients are okay, and especially, let's say, nitrogen? It's pretty simple. Soil test every field and management zone every year. And I don't think we make enough use out of our soil tests. We do try to use them to predict fertilizer or manure requirements for the next year's crop. But there's another role or benefit of soil testing, and that's to evaluate or audit your nutrient management planning for the last year's crop. It helps you look at last year's soil fertility program to see if maybe there was a soil that had maybe a history of management a little bit different from your other fields, maybe had some manure, maybe it was in perennial forage at some point. And if there's more nitrate nitrogen left over, that could be the result of more N mineralization, for example. And then long-term, year after year, you can monitor for trends, upward or downward trends in soil fertility and soil health. So there's 3 good reasons to soil test every field every year, and I think we need to make better use of soil testing. So we've talked about the right rate. What about the right source? Of course, there's a lot of different sources available, but the basic sources we use for nitrogen, urea, ammonia, and UAN solution generally perform similarly if applied properly. Subsurface banded applications in the spring are pretty similar for all these nutrients. Of course, we don't recommend broadcasting anhydrous ammonia. And of course, if you broadcast urea without a urease inhibitor, it may be subject to volatilization as well. But if you are applying in mid-season, there's not too many other options except for surface applications. So we would recommend that UAN solution be triple banded, and urea should have a urease inhibitor to delay the formation of ammonia and reduce the risk of volatilization losses. But remember, the inhibition period is limited. You're still going to need rainfall within a week to 2 weeks in order for that urea to wash into the soil and have a low risk of volatilization. If you're thinking of applying nitrogen late in the growing season, after anthesis for wheat, for example, to increase your protein content, make sure you take steps to minimize leaf burn by diluting your UAN solution with water or applying a straight urea solution and applying in late evening so that you get the effect of the dew on the leaves to dilute the fertilizer. In terms of N losses, overall, we have way less loss in the prairies than in other regions of North America. So we don't necessarily see the returns on the enhanced efficiency fertilizers. But if you have these wet conditions at a certain time of year, or if you have them in certain places, like in the depressional areas of the landscape, this may be an opportunity for variable source fertilization. And nowadays, I think we have the capacity to put on the enhanced efficiency fertilizers in the depressional areas and put regular nitrogen fertilizer in the other areas, for example. So that's a brief conversation about sources. What about timing and placement? Banding is generally more efficient than broadcasting because it reduces the losses that are listed here. And it also improves the positional availability. And so that's an important factor to consider as well. Banding will reduce that risk of surface stranding and improves the positional availability to the crop. And this is something that is very, very important in the prairies where we have relatively infrequent summer rainfall events, that if you leave that nitrogen on the surface of the soil, it can be kind of difficult to rely on it to be available for crop uptake. And what you're doing is you're trying overall, though, to maximize the nitrogen uptake in the growing season and minimize the risk of loss outside those uptake periods. Because in early spring and late fall is when we have the most vulnerability to losing nitrogen. And so that leads some people into following practices in more humid areas of North America, where they do a lot of mid-season applications. And we've experimented with this in Amy Monget's high-yielding spring wheat project. She evaluated split applications, putting all the nitrogen on, like 110 or 140 pounds of N at planting versus putting on some of it at stem elongation or at flag leaf. And she found that by splitting the application, putting it on stem elongation in half of her sites, the sites that she looked after herself, there was actually a significant benefit in terms of yield and protein content. In the other half of the sites, 4 out of 8 sites, there was no difference. But this is still a good news story in that if you're risk averse and you want to minimize the risk of over-investing in nitrogen fertilizer next spring, if you have timely rains, and that's a big if, then you can get equal benefits from a mid-season application as you can from putting it all on and planting, if you get those timely rains. And then what's very important here is in this particular study, looking at a couple of examples, Brunkild, 2016 and 2017. The in-season applications here are in these red arrows, and the blue lines indicate rainfall events. And in both years, the good old days when Brunkild used to get rains, we had significant rainfall events within that week or two after the nitrogen was applied in mid-season, and that gives it a lot better chance to be used by the crop. That doesn't always occur. And Chris Holzapfel, I think, was online earlier this afternoon talking about some of the work at the Indian Head Agriculture Research Foundation. He's conducted experiments looking at different placements and sources of nitrogen fertilizer. And here's an example of some of his work with canola, and where it was side banded or fall banded, the yield was the best. And where the nitrogen fertilizer was broadcast either in fall or broadcast in spring or split applications, the crop yield response was less. And that was because in that particular pair of years, there wasn't the timely in-season rainfall to give the mid-season application access to that crop. And so we've seen this before at Indian Head. Chris published a paper with earlier work about 15 years ago with mid-season applications, and similar results. 2 years out of 3 good responses to mid-season applications, 1 year out of 3 a miserable response because the rain didn't come when it was needed. In terms of phosphate fertilizer sources, just good old-fashioned 1152 is preferred source for most prairie soils. The liquid formulations like ammonium polyphosphate performs equally well, but we haven't found any benefits for applying the liquid formulation over the granular, and other enhanced products have not shown any benefit over MAP or 1034. And remember, you still need to be applying phosphate at rates equal to removal in order to sustain your pea fertility over the long term. These microbials, mycorrhizal and oxidants, not shown consistent benefits. There's benefits in some situations and not others, and that's what you can maybe expect from biological additives. But basically, we're going out with the same old message: banding in or near the seed row at seeding is best, especially if the soil test P is low and the cold or dry soil is restricting the soil supply or root growth. And if you want to seed early, you've probably got those sorts of challenges to deal with. So once again, good reasons, same old reasons for seed row placement. Once again, going back to some of the Westco data, and this is metric measurements. I apologize for John Hurd. This is about 18 pounds banded is equivalent to 72 pounds per acre broadcast. So once again, much more efficient use of your phosphate fertilizer if it's banded in or near the seed row. A pictorial shot of the benefits of some starter P, just 10 pounds an acre of seed row phosphate on top of 30 pounds that was fall banded. That intimate contact between the seed and the fertilizer beneficial in this case, but of course we don't want people to overdo it. Here's a demonstration of seed row toxicity in canola in the spring of 2016, a very dry spring at Borders Prairie. Even just 20 pounds of phosphate per acre in the seed row with disc openers at 12-inch spacing, very low seed bed utilization. Some seed row toxicity problems here. Highly variable with weather conditions, but if it's dry, it's a very dangerous sort of thing to put much phosphate in with the seed of canola and other oilseed crops. So just to summarize, high prices for fertilizer and crops have increased the risk from over-fertilizing or under-fertilizing. And we've got to be extra careful with our practices. High prices for fertilizer and crops increase the rewards from the proper practices, rates, source placement, timing. Maximizing the return for your phosphate or nitrogen or fertilizer investment, you want to soil test as precisely as possible every year, every field, every management zone. And consider residual nutrients when you're picking different crops for different fields. On the nutrient management side, employ the 4R nutrient stewardship principles more carefully than ever and coordinate them with your overall cropping plan. And once again, just for this particular year, use soil tests to help select crops for each field. Depending on soil N and moisture, maybe put some modest rates of N away from the seed. For cereals and canola, band the starter P near the seed row, especially if the soil is cold and root growth is poor. follow the provincial recommendations for K, S, and micros. And if more conditions perk up and markets show benefits for protein premiums, which could be substantial this year, given the high prices of N fertilizer, a lot of people will be putting on lower rates of N. And you might want to consider some mid-season supplemental N.